Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar on clean, firm electricity supply and load growth. We're going to wait about 30 seconds and then we'll get started with the program. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on clean, firm electricity supply and load growth. My name is Jeremy Tarr. I'm the director of the State Policy Program at Clean Air Task Force. CATF's state advocacy leverages the deep technical and policy expertise that we're known for and provides timely, fact-based education, analysis, and insights to help advance clean energy and climate solutions across the country. We work with vital stakeholders, including state legislatures, governor's offices, executive agencies, communities, and others to help achieve economic, environmental, and public health goals through climate action and good policy. We have a great lineup today. Our expert panelists are going to guide us through a conversation about clean, firm electricity supply and load growth. This is an increasingly important topic as states across the country are experiencing load growth, increased demand, and are looking for solutions to meet this demand with reliable, affordable, clean energy. While variable renewable energy like wind and solar is a critical source of clean power, and we need all that we can get from it, the reality is that we need more carbon-free baseload pathways to fill gaps to get us all the way there. Decarbonizing the grid is going to take a wide range of clean energy resources, and clean firm power like geothermal and nuclear is going to be a part of the mix to help ensure a reliable and affordable power sector. As we all know, states are where the rubber meets the road on many issues, including in power sector planning. That's why we're so excited to be having this critical conversation today. Joining me on this webinar are Paula Leverett-Cobb, Clean Air Task Force's Senior Southeast Regional Policy Manager, Kasparas Spokas, the Director of CATF's Electricity Program, Kelly Joseph, a Senior Fellow of Electricity Market Design and Clean Energy Transition at the World Resources Institute, Vlad Gutman-Britton, the Director for Policy and Analysis at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, better known as NYSERDA. Thank you all for joining us. Our panelists are going to explain what clean firm is and relevant program design considerations, the implications on reliability and climate, as well as real-time considerations from a state perspective. So thanks all the attendees for being here today. I'll turn it over to Paula Cobb to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Jeremy, and welcome everybody. Thrilled to see you here. We're going to kick it off with Kasparas, and he is going to talk to us about the what, the why, and the how of clean firm technologies. Take it away, Kasparas.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks, Jeremy. So when we look at today's U.S. context, there are a couple of trends that we're seeing. If we could just go to the next slide, please. The key kind of topic and the main topic of conversation is this recent surge in load growth that has made both the total but also the clean electricity supply constraints clear. We have a lot of cost-effective solutions that exist today. These include wind, solar, batteries, new transmission, grid-enhancing technologies, demand-side solutions like demand response, efficiency, and so on. But there are overall shortfalls in the planning and supply chains of getting these solutions deployed as quickly as we need them. In addition, we have the need to commercialize new technologies, which we're bucketing under this clean firm label, that can increase the amount of options that can supply load growth in the future to support industry, economy, and energy security, to help also decrease customer costs, deep decarbonization. So we're going to cover kind of the what, the why, and the how for this later bucket of clean firm technologies in this presentation. Next slide. So what is clean firm? I'll say generally there is not a widely accepted definition. Clean generally refers to minimal emissions considering life cycle of plant and fuel. Firm generally refers to the ability to generate electricity on demand regardless of weather or time of day. Now, technologies that often fit into this category include nuclear, geothermal, and gas with high levels of carbon capture and sequestration. And then technologies that sometimes fit into this category include biomass or biomass with carbon capture. There, the key criteria is where the biomass feedstock is coming from, how it was cultivated, and then synthetic fuel combustion, such as combusting hydrogen fuel or combusting synthetic renewable natural gas. Here, it really depends on the emissions of that come with the supply chain of creating the fuel that matter. But generally, when we think of clean firm, these are the technologies that we are discussing. So now that we know kind of what it is, let's kind of talk about why we're even talking about these technologies to begin with. So next slide. I'm going to give you two perspectives in this webinar. The first perspective is these load growth and supply challenges that we're facing today, but could face for the foreseeable future. So next slide. As we have generally experienced, there are various factors at play that have resulted in a decreasing rate of high voltage transmission lines being developed and deployed in the US. Interconnection queues have swelled as they originally were not intended to be dealing with such large volumes of smaller renewable projects. And there are other supply chain issues that might become apparent, whether it's critical minerals or other implications with respect to trade that might limit supply going forward. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, when we look at deployment rates today, we're already starting to fall short of net zero scenarios. These figures look at modeling from the REPEAT project out of Princeton, looking at the net zero benchmark and referencing the EIA reference scenario. Contrasting the two, you see generally that the deployment rates would need to substantially increase very quickly to meet the overall net zero scenarios. Luckily, we do expect a surge in solar, but wind is kind of lagging behind. But overall, we're starting to see that long-term pace of development is starting to fall short. Next slide. In addition to that, we generally acknowledge that there is a lot of resistance to the deployment of clean energy projects. And in part, some of that is we're taking total land mass, available to us, trying to figure out potentially suitable land to develop projects on. And then once we have the practically developed land available, we have additional considerations regarding social license and political will. There was a study done that was published in Energy Policy a couple of years ago, generally showing that 80% of renewable developer cases face at least more than one type of opposition to deploying their projects. Next slide. So while generally there are a lot of headwinds, and these will be buffered by some of the tailwinds coming on, generally costs of clean energy technologies are falling down. The way that we go about developing projects is improving. There are reforms going along with improving transmission planning processes and interconnection queues. However, over time, we do expect that as the best sites get developed first, and as the best transmission capacity gets utilized first, we might run into headwinds. That's not to say we shouldn't work on improving our ability to deploy existing solutions. We should, and we should deploy these as quickly as we can, but we're just conscious that we might hit speed limits as we go. Next slide. So developing and commercializing new clean technologies simply adds new options that can allow us to meet future load growth. Some of these technologies, which we'll discuss a little bit later, have trade-offs that allow them to circumvent or to minimize some of the challenges that wind and solar or batteries face today. And so when we're faced with additional load growth that might come from electrification, industry, and so on, we'll have new options available to us to meet that with clean electrons. Next slide. As I mentioned, a lot of these clean, firm technologies have several advantages in terms of trade-offs. One, they're generally much more capacity dense and land dense from the perspective of deploying an clean electron into the grid. You just simply need less capacity to be built, which might mean less total projects to be sited and built. A lot of these clean, firm technologies also have a little bit more flexible resource potential to some extent. So that minimizes the overall amount of transmission build out that's necessary. And these three slides, we're showing three different scenarios that were modeled in the Net Zero America project, which I'm sure a lot of us here are very well aware of. The left scenario being the one with more firm resources, clean, firm resources, the rightmost with less. Just simply showing that in the first slide, or in the first figure on the left, you need less gigawatts per terawatt hours delivered. And then on the right, showing the amount of transmission that needs to be built relative to the amount of high voltage transmission in 2020. Next slide. As I noted, these resources are also very land dense. So to the extent that in certain regions, you might be experiencing land use competition or siting challenges, you can decrease the footprint of the electricity system quite significantly with some of these clean, firm technologies. This is an example out of Stanford University looking at the overall footprint of the Diablo Canyon power plant versus the amount of solar that would need to be built to provide the equivalent amount of electricity that Diablo Canyon. And the difference is quite stark. Next slide. So the second perspective is that clean, firm technologies could reduce the cost of deep, full, long-term decarbonization. So why is that? Let's get into it. Next slide. Taking a very simplified view of the electricity costs and needs, you have different electricity system components that span from kind of generation and storage, the wholesale transmission, that go down to the distribution level and distributed generation and storage assets. And then you have electricity system needs, right? We have reliability, resiliency, affordability, and clean. And our goal collectively as planners, policymakers, thought leaders is to reduce the cost of everything on the left while meeting all the needs on the right. Next slide. I want to contrast this a little bit with a metric that's often used in our industry called the levelized cost of electricity, which is really just a project level cost assessment where you take the lifetime project cost and divide them by the lifetime generation and discount it back to today to get the levelized cost of electricity for a project. And I contrast this because oftentimes clean electricity technologies are discussed from the view of how much does a project cost. And if we go to the next slide, that general perspective has a lot of shortcomings when we're thinking about long-term planning for deep decarbonization. Levelized cost of electricity does not consider when electricity is generated, how the system will evolve, does not consider how a certain resource will have an impact on system costs at a large scale. It ignores technology characteristics like dispatchability, inertia, black start. It ignores these land use implications or other non-electricity trade-offs such as jobs, and ignores supply chain risks. All of these are really essential kind of key components to considering how systems evolve. And so I think just separating that metric, which is often used in this context, to really start focusing on the system costs and how to minimize those over the long term. I always say the sum of the project levelized costs does not equal the system or the customer costs. So when we focus on system costs, and if we can go to the next slide, there's a general consensus that when you look at credible system modeling, that the costs of deep decarbonization are often less when you have additional options that include clean, firm technologies. On the left side, we have a study by Nestor Sepulveda that was done in 2018. On the right, a Stanford, California study. However, there are other studies in other regions that we could point to that have a similar final conclusion. Now, how much the costs are reduced and at what decarbonization threshold do the costs are diverging by systems that do or don't have clean firm vary, and they will vary on jurisdiction, will vary in terms of what costs materialize in the future. However, if we're trying to assess deep decarbonization costs, it's probably a good idea to have these technologies commercialized and in our arsenal to be deployed to potentially reduce the cost of final decarb. Next slide. This is just looking at a number of different system analyses that were done and plotting how much clean firm capacity was deemed cost optimal in some of these modeling runs. And there's a range going from a minimum to a maximum. All of this is to say that a lot of the studies show that at least some clean firm is very much cost optimal, and in some cases, a lot of clean firm is shown to be cost optimal, which means generally reducing costs. I want to emphasize that despite these two perspectives, it's very clear that we need to deploy wind, solar, transmission, storage, demand response solutions at a record pace, and they will be a large part of the solution. Next slide. But thinking about the potential risks of failure, whether it's a speed or scale issue, or whether it's a full cost of decarbonization issue, adding another option usually provides a lot more robustness to strategy. This is just a strategy matrix looking at two rows where the first row says, yes, the existing options are sufficient. The second row is no existing options are insufficient. And then columns with regard to whether new options were developed or not. In the bottom left, we have a scenario that results in failure. This is where the existing options were insufficient and no new options were developed. That's ultimately what we're trying to prevent from happening, in which case, when we enter the column where new options are developed, you see that generally we achieve success under both scenarios. If the new existing options were not necessary, we've paid a little bit more to commercialize them. But if they are necessary, they're almost essential to achieving our goals. Next slide. So this gets to how. How do we commercialize these technologies so that they're readily available? There are many levers that can be pulled here. Some of them are federal, some of them are state. They include things like direct investment, like grants and loans, indirect investments, like tax credits. Some of these technologies require advancing regulation, such as advancing advanced nuclear regulation at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Some of these have potential pull mechanisms, like advanced clean energy standard mechanisms that states can consider. These could include clean capacity, certificates and targets, clean peak standards, hourly clean requirements. And then last, you have community engagement, workforce development, and barrier removal. I believe there are still 13 states that have moratoriums against having new nuclear, as an example. So that's the what, the why, and the how. And I look forward to your questions at the end of this. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to Kelly Joseph to discuss coordinated planning for the energy transition. Kelly, off to you.
Thank you, Kasparis. Thanks, Kelly. And I'm just going to remind participants to please put any questions you have into that Q&A box, and we will address those in the latter part of the webinar. All right, Kelly, over to you.
Thank you. You can go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to talk about what I see are some key challenges in general for the energy transition, building on some of what Casper said, but talking in specific detail about some of the reliability challenges and how and why some of these clean, firm technologies could actually help. So as I see it, there are two main challenges for the energy transition in the US. The first is that there's a lack of coordinated policy, not just between the federal and state jurisdictions, but cross-sector, particularly the critical gas and electricity infrastructure sectors. This creates both reliability and investment risk. And in organized markets, which I'll talk about a little bit, prices or an LMP, they're really great for managing the efficient short-term dispatch of resources, but there are limitations to relying on these prices alone for the energy transition. You can go to the next slide, please. Just in a little bit of detail, there are three big policy gaps that I see. The first, as I mentioned, the state and federal, but in particular, that entities at the state and the federal level who set decarbonization targets are not the entities that have grid reliability responsibilities. This is an enormous policy gap. The second is that while the IRA provides technology neutral incentives, there really is a specific technical mix of resources needed to maintain reliable grid operations. And EPA carbon pollution standards have put a requirement for states to engage in meaningful community engagement. And to do that, they request or think about having entities reach out to reliability authorities, but there's really no coordinated regional planning mechanism to actually enable this kind of meaningful engagement. You can go to the next slide. I'm not going to talk about this, but the national entity in the United States setting reliability standards for the grid has already highlighted some of these reliability risks, particularly the cross-sector reliability risks with uncoordinated policy. You can go to the next slide. And this also creates investment risk. It makes it hard to focus investment on the kinds of technologies that can actually enable the reliable transition of the sector. Particularly because not all of these technologies may be possible in all geological locations, and not all of these technologies have the associated infrastructure that would be required in order to scale and actually deploy. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk in some detail about what grid reliability is, and hopefully that helps to set the stage for why some of these resources could be really critical. Next slide. So when we talk about grid reliability, if you're in the space, you've heard a lot about what's called resource adequacy. And these are really large loss of load probability assessments that system operators do just to make sure they have enough generation to meet expected peak demand. But there are several other components of what NERC defines as bulk electric system reliability, in particular operating reliability, which is what happens in real-time power system operations. And this is the ability to withstand sudden disturbances. And when you hear grid operators talk about things like essential reliability services or grid attributes or ancillary services, this is what they're really getting at. And this is the ability in real-time power system operations to meet these mandatory and enforceable reliability standards set by NERC. This is the ability to manage the system to contingency, so the loss of a generation resource or the loss of a transmission line doesn't mean reliability implications. This is how grid operators are able to respond to changes in grid frequency and maintain voltage stability. This is how you manage the supply and demand balance minute to minute. This is how you keep transmission lines within their rated limits. And how you do this is actually done by having quick start, fast ramping, dispatchable assets that can produce when called upon. So this third component, energy adequacy, is something that's a growing concern. You can go to the next slide, because you want to make sure that you have resources that can actually produce when called upon. So the reason why this matters, and some of you may be familiar with this, but this duck curve, right, that we've talked about in California for a long time, but a lot of other systems are seeing as well. It's this ability to actually manage that belly of the duck all the way up to where the load continues. So that's the net load challenge. And part of the uncertainty comes from not just having variable resources like renewable assets, but storage assets and gas assets that are the quick start, fast ramping resources that are commercially available today to meet those ramping needs. There's uncertainty associated with when they'll be needed and for how long they'll be needed. And storage assets are limited both by how much they can actually discharge when they're fully charged, and gas assets are limited by their ability to actually schedule and arrange fuel. This is all made uncertain, especially because there's uncertainty in policy targets. There's uncertainty of when and how, heating will electrify, transportation will electrify. Changing in extreme weather create uncertainty, and a lot of growth in customer-sited resources like distributed energy assets that are not visible today to bulk grid operators all increase the sources of uncertainty and changes in reliability risks in real-time power system operations, and the need to make sure that you have assets that can produce when called upon. You can go to the next slide. I keep talking about gas and electric interdependency, and the reason is because today natural gas assets provide about 40%. I think it's around 43% actually now. And they're increasingly used to provide this critical balancing energy, or they're the assets that enable grid operators to manage operational reliability. So the challenge in the US, because you can see on the left, as systems electrify, particularly as heating is electrified, what is expected to happen is that systems will become winter peaking. So these ramping needs, where you have these net load challenges, get even more pronounced, and you also have increased risk and increased reliability on the electric sector for the heating sector. So the challenge in the US is really bringing on clean, flexible, dispatchable resources while ensuring that the natural gas system is actually capable of supporting the electric system and its needs throughout the transition. A number of entities have pointed out that this may actually require strategic investment in gas storage. And some of this, as I mentioned, comes from this policy gap where you have states setting heating decarbonization targets without really considering bulk electric system reliability needs alongside that. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to very quickly talk through some of the regional market structures in the US of how we manage the bulk electric system. And these are regional transmission organizations, or RTOs, and energy imbalance markets. You can go to the next slide. So very briefly, balancing authorities are the entities throughout the United States that manage supply and demand in real-time power system operations. These are the entities matching supply and demand, meeting these operational reliability challenges. And the discussion for a long time has been, more regional integration provides what's called a diversity benefit that can actually help mitigate this net load uncertainty. The idea is, some regions have resources that might be producing at a time when others are not. You might have different weather patterns across a broader region. So the integration of more assets provides a benefit. But the focus on most of this conversation has been on which of these market structures, whether an RTO or some kind of an energy imbalance market, is better. But I think that these discussions actually ignore the kinds of coordination that's actually needed to enable those regional benefits in the first place. So you can go to the next slide. Very quickly, some of the key differences are how these assets that provide grid attributes, these essential reliability services, are actually what they're actually doing in these different market structures. So in the RTO, these assets are providing both balancing energy and operating reserves. And the RTO serves as the provider of last resort for those assets that are needed to provide grid reliability. In an energy imbalance market, only balancing energy is shared, not operating reserves. And balancing energy balancing authorities participating in these markets are not supposed to lean on their neighbors. So they're not actually supposed to rely on their neighbors for some of these resources. They're supposed to be procuring these on their own. You can go to the next slide. So how that's done in these different frameworks, in these different market frameworks, each state in these different market structures, states have different market frameworks. So you can have states in an RTO that may have restructured, but regardless of whether they've restructured or not, if you're in a regional transmission organization, there is no regional coordination for resources that provide balancing energy. It's done by prices alone. And if you're in an energy imbalance market, there is no regional coordination for the resources that are intended to provide these balancing energy resources that provide this diversity benefit. It's all done through individual utility IRP processes. You can go to the next slide. So I think the challenges with relying on market prices alone for the energy transition, you can go to the next slide, are quite pronounced. I'm going to just briefly talk about some of the economic theory in markets that did restructure. The idea was that prices alone would be the only mechanism that you need to have sufficient entry and exit of the kinds of resources needed to meet grid reliability. What was supposed to happen is that consumers would be exposed to very high prices, and in order to hedge that risk, they would actually find a load serving entity or a retail energy provider to enter into long-term contracts with generators to help manage that risk. And underlying all of this is the idea that electricity is a commodity and that markets for electricity are really just about hedging that price and delivery risk. But the idea is that resources are fungible. So it really doesn't matter what type of asset delivers energy. It only matters that energy is produced. I think that's been a challenging assumption from the beginning, given these operating reliability needs, and especially as the resource mix is changing. And it's not necessarily the case that any asset in real-time power system operations provides the same benefit. So relying on these prices alone has really never been a sufficient investment signal to meet reliability targets. We've always needed to have fixes in these markets, whether that's through capacity markets or an operating reserve demand curve. Prices alone have really never been enough. You can go to the next slide. And I bring all of that up also to point out that policy that goes beyond fixing some of these market failures or market going beyond just fixing markets in order to get back to relying on prices alone. We need something more than that. And I think policy in electricity markets tends to be much too limited. What we really need to enable technology innovation is policy that defines a direction, takes on risk, ensures committed capital beyond research and development and into deployment. And policy can invest in what otherwise would not happen, particularly what would not happen through market prices alone. The challenge, again, going back to the original slide, is that in electricity, a very specific technical mix of resources is needed. So we need very focused policy and really targeted IRA incentives to enable and de-risk and enable some blended finance structures for the kinds of assets that are not commercial today that could meet these system reliability needs. You can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So I think that policy really should focus on two timelines. The first is that we need to recognize that today we need resources that meet operating reliability in all hours and all seasons as more renewable resources come online. They have to provide very specific grid services. And today that's gas assets with sufficient fuel available, and that's increasingly battery assets. But what's key, especially in the short term, is to recognize and address gas and electric interdependency challenges that create reliability risk. And in the future, I would like to see policymakers focus on targeting incentives towards the kinds of resources that can actually replace the reliability services that gas assets provide. So again, these have to provide very specific grid services, and they need to focus on incentivizing new technologies like those listed below, these clean, firm, clean dispatchable technologies that are not commercial today. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this next one in super detail, but this is an example of a coordinated framework that I think could enable policymakers to both focus on what's needed in the short term and manage and create enabling frameworks for what's needed in the long term. And what this would do is actually have states use reliability coordinators. So these are the entities that have grid reliability responsibilities. In some areas, that's an RTO or an ISO. In other areas, you might actually need more balancing authority integration, because these energy imbalance markets that I mentioned, they're not the ultimate reliability coordinator. Balancing authorities still are. So you'd have to have a mechanism where states are using these entities that have grid reliability responsibilities and great system planning capabilities to help inform their policy choices. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's lots of options for how states could think about this. You can go to the next slide. A couple that would continue to use markets but not rely on markets alone is this idea of hybrid markets. So hybrid markets would create competition for the market rather than rely solely on competition in the market. So we wouldn't rely solely on prices alone. We'd recognize that policy is a driver of new entry, and policy that's informed by system planning and markets that are informed by system planning are needed. A couple of ways to think about that, especially in the short term, and then over the longer term, could be strategic reserves. So this would be a form of a hybrid market where there's a recognition that there are certain types of assets that are needed to ensure reliable grid operations, especially as sources of risk and uncertainty are changing, and especially in uncertain policy environments. These could be competitive auctions for very specific resources, could be gas resources, could be renewable resources directly connected to battery assets that are solely dedicated, to be charged by those renewable assets and are always available, fully charged if needed. This could be demand response. These would have to be probably something that goes beyond just solely relying on market prices, but is actually controllable, predictable demand. And then it could also be some kind of regional IRP or some kind of regional coordination procurement process for assets that could potentially meet this need. In the short term, that might be, again, some of these assets I mentioned, but in the longer term, you'd want to structure these auctions in a way that could enable these new resources when they become commercially available. And then the final slide, please. Next slide. So when I talk about all of this, I want to make sure I level set and say, I think that electricity is too important, it's too critical, and it's too essential to get this wrong. Reliability throughout the transition really depends on having a very specific mix of resources that not only meet policy targets, but meet balancing energy needs, load following, ramping, quick start, flexible assets, and meet operating reserve requirements. The transition must be orderly and it must be reliable. You have to have a gas system that's capable of responding to rapidly changing electricity system needs. We don't necessarily have that kind of a gas system today. And transitioning away, again, from these assets that provide critical reliability services really requires very focused policy, very coordinated policy and planning that we don't have today. And then on the final slide, I've just listed, if you're interested, I've written several papers on each of these topics. So if you're interested in more detail behind a lot of what I said, you can go there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate that perspective. And now we're going to turn it to Vlad to present a state perspective for us.
Hey, all, happy to be with you all and participate in this conversation. I think I'll echo some of what other folks have already mentioned. So hopefully this is a useful sort of augmentation to the discussion that has already taken place. So on the next slide, I just want to highlight a little bit of the kind of the policy setting for the work that we do in New York and how we're thinking about and how we're situating these electricity goals in context of the broader economy. In 2019, the state adopted what's what we shorthand as the Climate Act, which includes a variety of goals for decarbonization and energy transition. They include, overall economy-wide targets, but they also include that sort of middle chunk there in alternating blues, a series of principally, not exclusively on this list, but principally electricity targets. So there's 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040, a 70% target by 2030, and some benchmarks for specific types of resources. Some of these have been upgraded in the intervening years. So this is the North Star. This is where we're going and how we're thinking about our energy, electricity planning in context in the kind of statewide energy economy context. So on the next slide, I want to kind of show a little bit of how we modeled that transition. So when we look at these charts on this and the next slide are included in the scoping plan the state of New York published and finalized at the end of 2022. Where we included what we call the integration analysis, which is an economy-wide look at what do the targets on the previous page require us to do. And so, there's some differences in New York from maybe other pathway studies and analyses that you've seen, but broadly speaking, I don't think that this should depart broadly from this should depart substantially from other kind of analyses that people have seen and have looked at. And so what you see is a gradually increasing penetration of renewable installed capacity on the left and energy generation on the right. Solar and wind are dominant contributors to the energy picture in New York over time. That's both onshore and offshore land-based and offshore wind. And we continue to make investments in this kind of energy transition. On the left, you can see in the installed capacity, you have this emerging pink wedge, which beginning in 2040. And that pink wedge is what in this analysis we call the zero carbon firm resource. We're describing a little bit differently on this webinar. Other parts of the sort of New York policy apparatus refer to these as DFRs, dispatchable emissions-free resources. But that zero carbon firm resource is the clean firm resource that we're talking about. It's something that is intended to provide that kind of essential energy service to bridge the bulk of energy which comes from renewables, but becomes a kind of key moments throughout the year. And so the difference between the chart on the left, the installed capacity, and the chart on the right, the annual generation, the fuel mix for the annual generation is pretty substantial. And you can see how there's the installed capacity of these DFRs, of these firm resources, is pretty high, or relatively high compared to their energy contribution, which you can see on the right is relatively small. And another perspective on this is on the next slide. So what you're seeing on the right is a kind of a wrap up of how electricity is generated within the boundaries of the state of New York. And you can see what that looks like in 2021. It's really dominated by fossil fuel thermal plants, principally natural gas and fuel oil and the like. We also have a nuclear fleet that is providing an important contribution in New York. And then some renewable generation early on in this kind of 2021 period is really dominated by hydro, but it's gradually going to expand over time. And on the right, you can see really what this point that we're making about what that transition looks like. And so you see nearly 95% of energy services being met by renewables, and this tiny sliver, I want to say about 2% of energy needs being met by these DFRs, by this clean firm technology, which is really essential. And on the left, you can sort of see why it's essential. So what you're seeing on the bottom kind of chart on the left is the kind of energy mix for the 52 weeks of the year in 2050. And on the top, what you're seeing is what a particularly hard week in the winter looks like. And so you can see that even though on an annual basis, renewables are serving 95%, almost 95% of our energy needs in the state of New York, in this particular week, that clean firm, DFR, zero carbon, firm capacity, whatever you want to call it, is really providing a very substantial share of the contribution. So on this week, this is a cold, still cloudy week in February. We're still seeing substantial contributions from offshore wind, land-based wind, and solar, but they're not by themselves meeting the need. And what's particularly critical about this is that even though we're installing substantial amounts of storage, because the renewables are generating relatively low, you can't rely on what some prescribe as solar, wind, water, and a lot of storage, right? There's just not enough excess generation within this particularly difficult week for storage to really close the gap. We're not generating enough extra renewables in certain hours to be able to sort of fungibly use it at other hours. And so in this week, zero carbon firm, it's still not, I don't believe, I'd have to look it up. Yeah, it's not a majority of the generation, but it is absolutely essential for almost every hour of that week to keep the lights on. And again, remember, this is a difficult week in February, right? This is a week when it's particularly cold. In this scenario, more and more people are using a dominant share of folks are using heat pumps, and so relying on electricity for a safe, comfortable temperature. And so that kind of shortfall that you would see in this case without the renewables, it's unacceptable in this week. And you can see, if you look at the 52 weeks of the year at the bottom, that while those kind of winter months are the places where we have the kind of dominant use of these clean firm technologies to kind of close the gap between renewables and load, you can see clean firm kind of popping up in the summer peaks as well when air conditioning is ramped up. But what's important here is that while the zero carbon firm technologies are really essential in those places, they're not competing with, it's not zero carbon firm, it's not clean firm technologies or renewables. What this modeling has really led us to conclude is that clean firm technologies are not working across purposes, they're an enabler for a renewable future. In order to have this sort of renewable future, which is indeed the way to have the sort of least cost pathway to a decarbonized electricity system, we need to find what that zero carbon firm resource looks like, deploy it at an appropriate scale so it's available for us when we need it, and rely on solar, wind, water, et cetera, for the rest of the time. So on the next slide, I want to kind of talk a little bit about the sort of policy pathway and the policy work that the state is kind of undertaking to tackle this issue. In 2023, our Public Service Commission issued an order initiating a process to really define and scope and chart a path toward this 0 by 40 future, and identify what is that clean firm resource, that DFIR resource, that zero carbon dispatchable resource look like that is going to be available in 2040. And so that proceeding really is looking at a broad sweep of issues related to achieving that 0 by 40, that 100% clean target by 2040 and beyond, and seeking to really understand to solve those last couple of percents that really need to be incorporated to achieve that deeply decarbonized, deeply renewable future that we've been discussing. And so as part of that, NYSERDA has taken on, is advancing a techno-economic study that we'll be publishing in the coming months that is focused on 7 candidate resources, 7 resources that may be a part of or substantially contribute to serving this clean firm need. And those are listed there on the left. And we obviously are looking broadly at these resources, but wanting to understand the particular application in the state of New York. So for example, geothermal, what we may find is that geothermal, while a substantial resource in certain parts of the country, in the West, for example, may not be as large of a contributor in New York, which doesn't undercut it as a resource broadly, but we need to recognize the kind of resource and availability needs in our particular geography. But we're also looking at things like hydrogen, advanced nuclear, the role of RNG, long duration energy storage, virtual power plants, and the like. So on the next slide, I want to kind of talk about what the kind of techno-economic study is intended to tackle, what kinds of questions are really going to be asking. So NYSERDA is working with APRI on the commissioning and completion of the study, and we really want to go deep on our understanding of the technical, financial, economic implications and choices and trade-offs of these resources. So we want to understand the performance characteristics, the technology, commercial infrastructure, and supply chain readiness for these different candidate resources and their ability to deliver by 2040. So what are the lead times? What are the kind of maximum potential that we can anticipate being available by 2040 and beyond? Again, as I mentioned on geothermal, the geographic suitability potentially. We care, of course, about their emissions and stakeholder considerations. People have concerns about citing more different types of resources and so on, to kind of really understand and stress test the sort of political and stakeholder considerations of these kinds of choices, and of course the cost. And while this techno-economic work won't include necessarily, dedicated modeling to sort of incorporate this study, this analysis into sort of capacity expansion modeling, we're seeking to use this to be able to inform future capacity expansion modeling, so that we can, characterize the availability characteristics and costs and things like that of these resources, and then really fit them into modeling that helps us understand what role they may contribute in our 2040 pathway. say, similar to the results on the previous page, we want to be able to enhance and deepen our evaluation and characterization of these resources as we model out and plot out our future. We're proposing to group these resources into sort of categories of service, right? They're high capacity factor resources, so that could be, and resources like CCUS and nuclear that provide both capacity and energy services. Low capacity factor resources that are principally there as capacity resources, peakers and things like that. That could be, hydrogen combustion and things along those lines. And then what we call gap right sizing resources. So resources that are that reduce or shape the need for this clean, firm technology, but probably by themselves aren't enough to close that gap entirely. And that could be things like long duration energy storage, virtual power plants, and the like. In addition, because on the next slide, sorry. In addition, because we recognize that of the many technologies that I sort of identified on the previous list, nuclear is one of the ones with a longer lead times and has a rising interest from industry, from political leaders in our state and beyond, et cetera. We are doing an additional sort of focused area deep dive master planning effort in the nuclear space. So NYSERDA organized and hosted last September the Future Energy Economy Summit, where we brought together experts on the electricity system, nuclear power, dispatchable emission-free resources, and the like. And at that conference, at that summit, we published this blueprint, which is a scoping document for research into the advanced nuclear and what it might take to deploy advanced nuclear in the state of New York. A few months later, we published an RFI for folks, stakeholders, and industry participants to help us answer questions that are necessary for the state of New York to really understand issues and opportunities in the nuclear space. And earlier this year at her State of the State, Governor Hochul directed NYSERDA to launch a 2-year advanced master plan process. And so this is the sort of next steps beyond this blueprint that we published last fall, and will enable us to really kind of chart out in more detail what might the nuclear future look like in New York, which isn't to say that nuclear will be by itself or anything like that, the clean firm resource that we select, but it is certainly appears to be a part of our mix, and so we want to really make a down payment, substantial progress on understanding what it might take to deploy that. New York's also leading co-leading, I should say, a multi-state initiative organized with NASIO around the deployment of nuclear power with a number of our peers across the country. And then we're supporting an application for federal funding submitted by Constellation to help site and develop nuclear assets at an existing nuclear facility, a nuclear site that exists in New York. So on my last slide, I want to talk a little bit more about the nuclear master plan and what we want to tackle and the types of questions that we're seeking to answer as we engage in this master planning exercise. So it's a master plan, which means it's a super study. It's a meta study that'll include multiple individual studies that really kind of chart out the issues and options and opportunities along the entire the comprehensive total set of questions that we need to answer around this specific technology. So you see listed on the left there, we want to tackle issues around technology feasibility, policy options and costs, environmental and climate justice, regulatory safety, siting, waste, supply chain, workforce, et cetera. This is the kind of comprehensive perspective that we need to really bring this technology to market in New York. And we hope that, obviously it contributes to advancement of this discussion here in New York specifically, but broadly around the country, as well as we tackle these questions that many geographies, many states, et cetera, are really kind of looking at as they explore the possibility of pursuing a future that is both nuclear and renewable. We'll also develop technical working groups that will create space for stakeholder engagement. It's very important to us that we're hearing from our stakeholders in New York and beyond. And again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, engaging in these multi-state and federal processes to continue moving the ball forward in the nuclear space in New York State. So that's what I have to share with you. Happy to answer questions when it's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad. Appreciate it. We actually do have a couple of questions. I'm going to start with you, Vlad, because we've got a couple that just rolled in about what your presentation. So the first one is, so NYSERDA has modeled their DFR resource as a generator with a high cost clean fuel. But the roadmap appears to be focused on nuclear. And so how could having commercially available new nuclear impact the decarbonization modeling results?
Yeah, and I guess just to say is that, you know, in the scoping plan, yeah, we selected in the scenario that I showed, we had a few scenarios just to be clear, but in the scenario that I showed, we used hydrogen combustion as the representative of what that resource is, which wasn't us saying it will be hydrogen combustion, but you got to tell the model something. and so that's what we selected. At the time, we also did a run with RNG as the available resource. We did a run with a simple characterization of advanced nuclear as well. And what our work since then has done is continue to move that ball forward. So as part of the state energy planning process, we'll continue that research as well and publish analysis on that question as well, that dives more deeply into these questions. At the time when we published the results that I shared, we also completed a sensitivity on the low-cost advanced nuclear. So we took available at the time projections of where the cost of the optimistic future for advanced nuclear costs may go, and gave that to the model as an available option for deployment. And what we found was that the model did in fact select some amount of nuclear power. I want to say about 4 gigawatts of capacity by 2050 were selected by the model while continuing to deploy solar, wind, and the like. And that reduced the cost of the electric sector energy transition, the path to 0 by 40, by about 8%. So by making available nuclear to the model to select instead of, or I should say, in addition to hydrogen, we continue to use hydrogen combustion because hydrogen combustion is more flexible in the way we kind of characterize its use. You can ramp it up very quickly for short amounts of time, which is difficult to do with certain types of nuclear. We saw a greater diversification of resources, more selection of nuclear, and reduced costs. And we're looking forward to advancing a lot more thinking on that question over the course of this year.
Thank you. I might come back to you for one other question, but I'm gonna go to Kelly quickly for a question we got on response to advocates who insist that, you know, you don't need new technologies to achieve deep decarbonization. And Caspers, feel free to jump in as well if you have something in addition to Kelly. And it looks like the particular commenter here is trying to dig into, you know, the folks who say the existing suite of solar, wind, and storage technologies are enough to get us there. What would your response be to a question like that?
Yeah, thanks. So that's why I talk a lot about how grid reliability works. And, you know, in the analysis that I just presented, the assumption is the grid is made up of a lot of renewables, and here's what it takes to meet some operating reliability needs. You know, grid operators have to balance supply and demand. They have to manage voltage stability, frequency regulation. You know, and the way to do that is through quick start, fast ramping resources that can produce when renewable resources are not there. So those net load periods. And then again, you know, as you transition to reach state electrification targets for heating, that shifts that ramping need into the winter where you have some of these really pronounced gas and electric coordination challenges. So to the extent that you, you know, do not have resources that can provide the same reliability services over the same period of time. So making sure that you have long duration storage assets. We don't have long duration storage assets commercially available today. You know, and then having these other resources that can provide those same quick start, fast ramping capabilities. So it's you know, reliability needs are shifting, and having the types of resources that can meet that at all periods is still needed.
Thank you. Caspers, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add, you know, sometimes the source of this hypothesis can come from a model that might not capture some of the granularity, real world granularity, whether in time or space or transmission representation, or simply the amount of hours that they're modeling in, you know, or the weather years, extreme weather events. There are many layers to having a very comprehensive, robust model of the electricity system. And generally, the more real world granularity you have, the more it becomes more difficult or costly to meet it with existing technology suites. I think that's why we're seeing NYSERDA, looking at these technologies for their state goals. That's why we have large customers like Google, explicitly stating that these new technologies would significantly reduce their targets for their needs, given even today's prices. And then, as I mentioned in my remarks, there's also just the speed and pace challenge with deploying clean energy sources. Simply put, having more options that have different trade-offs might lend a much more robust strategy, so that if you do hit speed limits in one solution set, you'll have another solution set that might have favorable trade-offs to continuing to decarbonize while meeting load growth.
Got it. Thank you, Kasparas. And we are at time. Jeremy, I'm going to turn it to you to conclude. Appreciate all of you panelists.
Attendees, thank you for being here today, and our excellent partners and presenters. If anyone has questions, please reach out to any one of our presenters for more information. We're going to have a recording of this video of this webinar available online and emailed to you all shortly, as well as a link to our first state policy webinar from February, which was on clean electricity standards. So today was the second webinar in our 2025 state policy webinar series. The next one is going to be on state low carbon fuel standards. That's a program designed to reduce emissions in transportation fuels. We'll share more details in the coming days, but for now, please hold April 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for that low carbon fuel standard webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.